Claudio, welcome to the Baker Institute. It's a pleasure to have you here. Claudio X González is a co-founder and president of Mexicanos Contra la Corrupción y la Impunidad, MCCI, a citizen initiative to combat corruption and impunity in Mexico. González is also the co-founder and former president of Mexicanos Primero, a citizen initiative that advocates to improve public education in Mexico. Among other roles, González served as the president and advisor of Becalos, the largest program for non-governmental scholarships in Mexico, and as co-founder and honorary president of an organization that has delivered computers and internet to more than 8,000 public schools in Mexico. He previously served as co-founder and president of Fundación Televisa. González earned a bachelor's degree in law from the Escuela Libre de Derecho in Mexico City and a master's in law and diplomacy and a PhD in law and international relations from Tufts University. Thank you, Claudio, for being here.
Tony, thank you very much.
I have some questions for you. The first is, the New York Times has actually said something about you. Mm-hmm. And they have said that you are someone who has spent nearly 2 decades fighting the twin plagues of corruption and impunity in Mexico. Please tell us about your efforts to fight corruption through the civil society organization known as MCCI, Mexicanos Contra la Corrupción and Impunity. And let me translate this for our audience: Mexicans Against Corruption and Impunity, MCCI.
First of all, Tony, thank you very much for the invitation to be here at Rice University. Wonderful campus, incredible university, and specifically at the Baker Institute. It's a great pleasure.
Welcome.
And I truly believe, Tony, that there are 2 things in my generation that as Mexicans we have to ground, to fix, in order for Mexico to have a fuller development and more justice and prosperity. Quality education and rule of law. And I have devoted my professional life to these 2 themes, trying to bring about systemic change in education so that our children have the opportunity that they deserve to realize all of their potential. That's the only way to push our society forward. And second, the rule of law is very fragile in Mexico, if it exists at all. I mean, you have to question whether there is a rule of law in Mexico. We have to build the institutions that will create incentives that will bring about a culture of legality in Mexico. And I think this is a challenge for all of Latin America. So I've been devoting my life to these 2 issues. And of course, combating corruption and impunity, both in the educational sector and in general in our society, is critical to bring about the desired result. I was a public servant at the beginning of my career, after coming back from doing my master's and my PhD. After some time, I decided I did want to do public service, but not in the public sector. So I have devoted my life to activism, to try to bring about those 2 results: quality in education, rule of law, and combating corruption and impunity in both sides of the equation. It is an absolutely necessary firm platform on which we have to build the development of our country, and we have a huge challenge. Let me tell you that impunity for crimes committed in the year 2016 in Mexico stood at over 97%. So we're only being 2.5% effective in having consequences for crimes. Corruption, crime exists everywhere in the world. What makes Mexico worse off and lagging behind the world is that there is huge impunity. This is Mexico's chief enemy.
So if somebody commits a crime on you and you're the victim, the chances of the perpetrator being punished are less than 3%.
Absolutely.
And what are the hopes that you will get restitution of any kind, justice, simply, for this crime?
Probably none at this point in time, Tony. And this is shameful, and we have to change this, because those 2.5% usually are petty crimes. They're not even the important criminals that are being prosecuted and sentenced. And we have to change that, and we have to change that as quickly as we can, because us humans react to incentives, and if there is no cost to going about your business in this illegal fashion, in this criminal fashion, then you go about it. Not everybody, of course, but a few will, and they will damage society very severely. And in this respect, we're defenseless in Mexico right now. And I think the latest electoral results, both at the local level and the federal level, show that people want justice, that people want security, that people want crime to be punished, that people want corruption to be punished. And both the federal government and the state governments are not doing their job, not by a long margin. I mean, imagine, Tony, an enterprise that does candy. Only 2.5% of its candy is good, and 97.5% of its candy is sour and bad. That would be a broken enterprise. It would go out of business immediately. Well, that's kind of the state of our the justice system, and it's we have to admit it, and we have to change it radically in order to give the next generations a chance to fully develop and to have justice. I mean, governments are instituted in many ways to provide security and justice. That's their main function. So the main function of the Mexican government is not being fulfilled.
So, Claudio, you've heard this question before, perhaps. Obviously, you've invested a lot of resources, energy, and time, decades of your life to this issue. So you've been compared to ProPublica in the United States. Is that a good comparison? Is that a good aspiration? Is that a good thing that is done often? Compare MCCI and your efforts to what ProPublica does in the United States?
Well, first of all, it's an honor, it's a privilege to be somehow compared to ProPublica. We esteem that organization very much. We admire it very much. Of course, it's been going on for longer than we have been going. And it's partly true that we are similar to ProPublica in that we are both think and do tanks, that we are both against abuse and corruption and impunity, and that we do investigative journalism to try to combat the problems that we're trying to abolish. Now, there are, of course, differences. They are more prestigious, they are better known, they win lots of Pulitzers. We haven't won any of those, although we've won some very important prizes in the Ibero-American side of things. But we are a more complex organization than ProPublica in some respects, Tony, in that we both do investigative journalism, but we also do applied research regarding different aspects related to the corruption issue in Mexico, issues like illegal financing of campaigns, nepotism in the judicial sector, problems in our health system. Even we do also applied research regarding, for example, the compliance of enterprises in Mexico regarding anti-corruption measures. And so a host of things that we diagnose and where we propose solutions. This is something that ProPublica does not do. Another thing that we do is that when our applied research arm and our investigative journalism side provide us with enough evidence to litigate, we go forward with litigation. We have more than 100 litigations ongoing on the administrative side, on the criminal side in Mexico. We've won some, we've lost some. Many of them are ongoing. As you know, these are long processes. But ProPublica does not take that step of going forward with litigation. And I think in our scenario in Mexico, it's critical not just to showcase the networks of corruption as ProPublica does and we try to do, but also to literally go against them with litigation. And we also have a communications and mobilization arm. As ProPublica, we are not a media outlet. We have to find media outlets. And we also have to work on the web very well, in Twitter, Facebook, and all the different platforms. So in that respect, we have 4 different areas where ProPublica would have one of those areas. Of course, they are very, they do a great job, and we try to emulate what they do in investigative journalism, but we try to put these other 3 parts together to have more impact in the Mexican context, because in the US, there is a lot more civic participation, and for example, your judicial sector is stronger and more independent than Mexico's is. So I think we have to do more than ProPublica, because there are certain areas in our society that we have to try to cover and to push forward. So it's a very ambitious project, complex, and that is what I think differentiates us from ProPublica.
Yeah. So this has a cost. You obviously pay a personal cost, you pay a reputational cost, you have your critics, your detractors, and even harassers. The government used spyware on civil society organizations, including yours. Obviously, there's a lot of harassment. You've been the object of this. What do you think? How do you feel about, and how do you protect the people from MCCI? Your friends and collaborators and people committed to this from this kind of harassment and criticism and even aggressive behavior by the Mexican government and other detractors?
We have lots of detractors, Tony. It, as you guys say colloquially, it comes with the territory. No, we knew that this was going to happen. We didn't have any hope that we were just going to be able to do our job and not be somehow confronted. It is clear that if you confront and go against corruption, corruption is going to try to fight back. No? We had this last administration, the Enrique Peña Nieto administration, one of the worst records ever in terms of corruption and impunity in Mexican history. And that is saying something, because we've always had this problem. But it got even worse during that administration. And we were there to highlight the main problems, the main modus operandi and networks of that corruption. And we knew that they were going to hit back, and they did. They did with audits, both on the fiscal side and on the labor side, not just against MCCI, against me personally, against these other organizations that you highlighted. I have founded over time, like Mexicanos Primero, like Aprender Primero, like Únete, Technology for Education, projects that are very noble, that serve society. Well, they went against this and audited them and harassed them. It's still an ongoing process, Tony. But we cannot let up. I think it's the job of our generation to stand up and say, we cannot take this anymore, we will not take this anymore, and we will try to give to the next generation a different condition and situation from the one we face, because this is having hugely negative impact on our society. Somebody has to stand up to this. We're not the only ones. There are many, many organizations and brave people in Mexico standing up to this, Tony. But we're trying to do our share as well. And you're right, we've been attacked with these audits and also with espionage. Espionage through our cell phones, They bought the Attorney General's office bought spyware from an Israeli firm. The condition was that they would not use it, or they would only use it against organized crime, and they decided to use it against journalists, defenders of human rights, and activists. Of the 24 cases that the New York Times was able to fully prove that we had been spied, 3 cases are within MCCI, 2 journalists and myself. I donated my cell phone to Canadian University so that they can see how to block this sort of spyware on the Apple phones and other types of phones. And of course, we denounced this formally, but we did it through the Attorney General's office, who we suspect was probably the one that was trying to spy us. So these sorts of things sound ridiculous, and they are, but somebody has to stand up to them. Let me say, Tony, this, and I will say this modestly but firmly, that our best investigative journalism, our best research, our most important litigations and communication efforts have come after we were harassed with the audits and with the espionage. You asked me, how are we protecting ourselves? By keeping the offensive.
Right.
By keeping the offensive. That's the only way that we can try and protect ourselves.
Yeah, it's important because there's obviously, you have a lot of people working with you, and it's important that even their personal safety be guaranteed somehow. So I don't want to go into the details because obviously we don't want to, I'm sure you take measures, and it's not our job to reveal what those measures are, but certainly it should be a worry. I think it's probably
Well, let me
quite
tell
a
you,
concern.
Tony, you would be surprised. We don't take that many measures. We don't take that many measures because we don't really think that there are that many measures that we could take if somebody wanted to harm us. We do the very basic things, but we go about our business as any citizen
But it's
would.
very valiant in the sense that we know that Mexico is an extremely dangerous place for journalists. And a lot of these journalists who are killed throughout the country, dozens of them every year, is because they're looking into things that, the targets of those journalistic investigations don't want them to be looking into. So they target them.
You're right, and I would say that being based in Mexico City and being an organization that has such high profile and that is clearly seen as a counterpart to corruption in government, in the private sector, wherever it is, but particularly public sector corruption, we have certain protection, being in Mexico City and being so high profile. When you try to talk about brave people giving a fight, it's journalists in Veracruz, in Tamaulipas, in Sinaloa, in Chihuahua. Those guys are brave because they are going it alone and they are less protected and they don't have this high profile. They're not in Mexico City. They're facing not just the federal government, but local governments, both at the state level and the municipalities, who are savage, many of them, and that's where we have to put our eye on in terms of bringing security for activists and journalists and defenders of human rights in Mexico, for these people.
One of the greatest contributions of your organization, MCCI, has been the enormous threat that eventually became the estafa maestra, or the masterful scam, or some equivalent translation. How did that happen? How did you run into it? What were the consequences? Can you tell us a little bit about that particular scandal, which ended up having a great impact in public opinion and even important political figures like the PRI candidate, Mr. Meade, in the last election?
Well, this comes from our investigative journalism side. These guys, 10 of them, very keen journalists who work with complete freedom to find corruption scams, have produced 106 different stories over the last 3 years regarding different networks and schemes of corruption in our country. Probably the best known of them is the one you're mentioning, Tony, the great scam, la estafa maestra. And we worked that story with Animal Político, which is one of the best news outlets in our country. They work on the web, but they're very keen and they're very good. And we work together to develop this story. We have 11 Mexican ministries, governmental entities, that have to bid for different things. And there is ever more light on these bidding processes for the ministries. So what they devised, and they're very audacious and they are very smart to do wrongly, is if the light is shining on the bidding processes that we have to carry out, why don't we send a whole bunch of money, in this case $350 million, off to the autonomous universities, the public universities in the States. Because of their autonomy, they don't have such a strict bidding process. So let's send the money over there, let's obscure that money, and the universities will contract with fake enterprises in their states to funnel that money off to be stolen or to be sent to electoral process or wherever. We checked about 3.54% of the total contracts that were being done by the entities with the autonomous universities, and from there to the ghost enterprises. And it was $350 million approximately. So the scam is much bigger than we were able to detect, but we detected the modus in which they were operating. And this created a huge scandal. This was in late 2017. Everybody in Mexico was talking about it. Our communications effort was really good, with infographics, with interviews, with just proven from beginning to end, no? So it became a huge issue. Even now, the present government, the López Obrador government, is going after the people who carried out this scam. We are litigating against the main perpetrators on the federal government, the universities, and the fake enterprises. We have many different legal actions going against them, and we hope there is some consequence to this having happened, no? And we're also trying, through our applied research arm, to close the normative hollows or those spaces in our legal framework that permitted this money just to flow and be stolen and used diverted for illegal purposes, no? So we hope we're closing that window of corruption, and we have to be looking at different windows of corruption and trying to shut all those windows over time. Of course, when you shut one down, they try to open another one. Well, right. It's a never-ending story, right. Tony, you know that.
So I guess that leads me to the next question. What are you working on now? Is there particular leads that you are following, particular cases that you're paying a lot of attention, that your organization is on, perhaps as big as the estafa maestra or lesser, but that you think are important?
Absolutely. We're always doing a strategy and tactics to try to determine our path, and I couldn't tell you exactly what we're working on, because until we bring it out, right. We have to be very, very discreet. But we're also always looking to have a showcase of the wider range of different corruption problems that there are in Mexico. We're not only focusing on the federal government. We also focus, for example, and try to look at the judicial sector. We try to look at the legislative sector. We try to look at the local level governments. We try to look at how the enterprises are doing and how corruption in the private sector is comporting. And we have to be, in this respect, plural, because corruption is widespread, unfortunately. It's systemic, and we have to be showcasing the different types of problems that we have in order to end it all. Many people think corruption, they think about presidents, ministers, governors. No, it's a much wider array of problems, and sometimes it's people who are criticizing corruption are perpetrating acts of corruption themselves that they do not think are corruption acts. So we have to be highlighting all of these different types to be fully effective in bringing about a culture of legality, the rule of law, through the combat of corruption and impunity.
Claudio, is Mexico doomed to be corrupt? I mean, this is something that's been going on for decades and only gotten deeper, and Mexico has lost several notches on its grading in terms of corruption in the international organizations like TI that measure this. Or do you see progress? Do you see a breaking point, a tilt in the curve that you think might just make a difference?
You have to be hopeful, Tony, that we can beat this thing. Of course, you never beat it fully. I mean, it's an ongoing thing here in the U.S. or in Scandinavia or wherever you go.
And the U.S. just got downgraded too.
Yeah.
So
you always have to keep up your guard. What has happened to Mexico is that we're lagging behind. There's been a problem, not just, I would say, Tony, for decades. It's been a centuries-long issue. But I would also state this. This is a human phenomenon. And some societies are farther along the line of combating it and diminishing it so that there can be healthy growth in different societal areas. And we have not been able to do that containment. But that does not mean that we cannot do it. We will do it. I am hopeful because there is social momentum for this. The last 6 or 7 years, elections have been pretty much decided, Tony, on who the people felt was the candidate that was the most committed to combat corruption and insecurity at the state level and at the federal level. Mr. López Obrador was able to put himself in that position as the man who would combat insecurity and corruption, and he was elected by a wide margin. And he has a lot of legitimacy to go after corruption. I hope he does it correctly. But there's this big social push against corruption in Mexico. Politicians hear that. Politicians understand that. Politicians will move against it. Maybe not at the speed and exactly with the policy remedials that we would love for them to apply, but there is social movement in this respect. The fact that we are able to, for example, Tony, finance an effort like Mexicanos Contra la Corrupción, Impunidad, with all the dangers this implies from the Mexican citizenry and the Mexican private sector, tells you something. It tells you that people are fed up. It tells you that people are willing to take risks and chances to try to end this. So I think the message is clear to the politicians. We have to keep that momentum going. We have to push hard, not only the executive branch, very particularly the judicial branch, and this is where litigation comes in, to fulfill their potential and their role fully with sentencing, because we have to bring down impunity. And we have to be very adamant about the policy formulas, for example, the true independence of the Attorney General's office as a critical issue in order to push for rule of law for this to happen.
I mean, clearly this is a comparison with the Lava Jato case in Brazil, right? There you have a segment of the government, the prosecutors themselves doing the job from within the government, perhaps certainly endorsed by civil society. But in Mexico, you don't have that component.
No.
You don't have the prosecutors and the judges and this internal to the government component to create these kinds of alliances into the government.
You're completely right. I mean, Brazil is ahead of us in this game. Colombia is ahead of us in this game. Chile, of course, is ahead of us in this game. Peru is ahead of us in this game. So Mexico is usually stalwart in Latin America. In this respect, in the justice system, we're lagging behind. We have to push forward. And it has to be a societal push. It has to be a governmental push. It has to be the private sector pushing. We all have to push. But I think there's a consciousness, Tony, of the harm that corruption does to our potential that was not there fully before. And this is what makes me hopeful that we can indeed combat corruption. We have to take these very big steps. I think they will come, but we cannot let our guard down, as I was saying. We have to persevere. We have to be very determined. We cannot tire. We cannot tire. We just have to go forward and push, and little by little we'll make these changes come about. No country, Tony, no matter how advanced they seem to be, let me talk about Scandinavia that seems so forward in so many respects at this point in time. I mean, some time ago, these guys were the barbarians.
Right.
No? They were the uncivilized people of the world. Everybody said, no, if these guys arrive, the world will come to a close, no? And now they are our model.
Right.
So everything is in flux, everything changes, and we just have to move faster going forward. I think Mexico is one of the countries, because of its size, 130 million people, because of its geographic situation next to the U.S. and part of North American agreement that I think is privileged for the 21st century, because of its youth, Tony, has huge, huge potential. It's one of the few countries that can have an impact for the 21st century. Maybe not on the size of a China or an India, but we are a considerable player in the international scene, and we have to fulfill that role for the Mexican people and for the world of becoming a better country. And I think we can fully do that, and we're poised to do it, and we're going to be pushing very hard to have that happen.
Well, your enthusiasm, your courage, and your hope is contagious, Claudio. Please consider the Mexico Center an ally, a friend, and of course a forum whenever you need to let the American public know what you have found and what you're doing. This is your home in Texas, and so please come back anytime.
Thank you very much, Tony.
Thank you, Claudio. A pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.